It's Thebes. It's roughly 1350 BCE, and it's high noon, sitting at a genuinely brutal 110 degrees Fahrenheit. No air conditioning, no ice, no cold drink of any kind anywhere on the entire planet, because refrigeration is still 3,000 years away. The sand under your feet is hot enough to cook an egg on, in a country that's 95% desert, and you're standing there in a linen kilt, about to do a full day of manual labor, and you're fine. Not gritting your teeth fine. Genuinely fine. The way Tuesday is fine. You'll do this again tomorrow, and the day after that, for years. And if you're lucky, you'll live into your 60s, which is about as good as it got. Here's the misconception baked directly into the question we're asking today. We picture Egyptians white-knuckling their way through the heat, surviving through pure grit. That's not what happened, and it's wrong in a way that's actually more interesting than the myth. Egyptians weren't fighting the desert. They were living inside a system so quietly refined, it turned one of the deadliest climates on the planet into background noise. The walls that play tricks with time, a machine with 0 moving parts built from a hole in a roof, the reason wearing more clothing kept you cooler, and a twist near the end involving 2 words, Kemet and Deshret, that's going to change how you see the entire civilization. Let's go. Move 1. The wall that lies about what time it is. Start with the house, because this is where Egyptian builders were quietly doing something modern architecture is only now circling back to. Egyptian homes were mudbrick, Nile silt, and chopped straw, packed into molds and baked hard in the same sun the wall was built to defeat. There's a real irony sitting in that detail. Mudbrick carries enormous thermal mass, and here's what that actually means in practice. A thick wall doesn't block heat. It delays it. Sun hits that wall all day, and the heat crawls through slowly, taking hours to complete the journey inward. So the worst heat of the afternoon arrives inside your house around midnight, right when the desert outside has finally gone cold, and you actually want it. Then the process reverses, and the night's chill arrives at noon, exactly when you're desperate for it. Nobody in 1350 BCE was solving equations for this. They just noticed thick walls worked better than thin ones, and repeated the winning version for 3,000 straight years. Windows sat small and high, since hot air rises and needs an exit near the ceiling. Walls got whitewashed to bounce sunlight rather than absorb it. And the roof, flat by design, doubled as a bedroom. In the hottest months, entire families dragged their sleeping mats up there at night, where moving air and open sky pulled the day's stored heat straight off their skin. Sleeping on the roof wasn't the fallback option, it was the good one. Move 2, the machine with no moving parts. In the tomb of a nobleman named Nebamun, painted around 1300 BCE, there's a rooftop structure that's unmistakably a wind scoop, a malqaf, angled to catch Egypt's steady, reliable north wind. Wind hits the hood, funnels down a shaft, and delivers itself straight into the room below, while hot air escapes through those small high windows on the opposite wall. That's a pressure difference. That's a chimney, laid sideways, running entirely on wind and rising heat. 2 things that were never going to stop existing. No fuel, no motor. Then somebody pushed the idea one step further. Some households placed a porous clay jar of water directly in that incoming airflow. Water seeps through clay, evaporates on the surface, and pulls heat out of the passing breeze on its way through. The air reaching your room had already been cooled before it touched your skin. That's mechanically identical to the evaporative cooler you can buy today at a hardware store in Arizona for about $200, running on an electrical outlet. The Egyptians built it out of a pot and a hole in a roof. Move 3. Why covering up beats stripping down? Your instinct in extreme heat says wear as little as possible. The Egyptian answer disagreed, and the fabric doing the work was linen, woven from flax. Linen fibers are hollow, letting air move straight through the weave. It wicks sweat fast, spreading it thin for quick evaporation. And it's a poor insulator, meaning it never traps the heat you're actively trying to lose. Loose, pale linen draped over skin, blocked direct solar radiation while still letting sweat do its job underneath, which is exactly why bare skin in that sun wasn't freedom. It was just a faster sunburn. There was a real social gap sitting inside that same fabric too. Royal linen, worn by the elite, was woven so finely that surviving fragments today are nearly see-through. Field laborers wore coarse, heavy cloth, or often much less. Same sun, wildly different experience of it. And the shaved head and wig look wasn't purely fashion either. A wig sits slightly off the scalp, creating a small ventilated air gap, and unlike your actual hair, it can be removed, washed, and cooled on demand. The Greek historian Herodotus, visiting centuries later, noted the Egyptian obsession with washing with a tone of mild bewilderment, which is genuinely funny coming from a Greek. Move 4. A ration that doubled as a machine. Here's the fluid problem. You need several liters of water a day doing manual labor in that heat, and the Nile was right there, constantly flowing. It was also carrying parasites, silt, and waste. Traces of schistosomiasis, a parasitic infection, have actually turned up in Egyptian mummies, a direct signature of drinking straight from the river. So Egyptians drank beer, not a pint at happy hour. Egyptian beer was thick, low in alcohol, brewed from barley or emmer wheat, closer to a meal than a drink. It carried calories, B vitamins from the yeast, and because the mash got heated during brewing, it came out measurably safer than the water it replaced. This wasn't a lifestyle preference, it was payroll. At Deir el Medina, the well-documented village housing the craftsmen who carved the royal tombs, workers were paid directly in bread and beer, tracked meticulously on limestone flakes by scribes who recorded absences, complaints, everything. When those rations arrived late, under Ramesses III, around 1155 BCE, the workers put down their tools completely. Historians consider it the first recorded labor strike in human history, and it happened over food and beer. Once you understand the climate, that ration wasn't a perk, it was the cooling system. Cutting it wasn't frugal, it was switching off the water supply for men doing brutal physical labor in the desert. Move 5. The salt nobody was thinking about. You've replaced the water. You haven't replaced the salt, and salt is what keeps your muscles from cramping and your brain from fogging over by afternoon. Egyptian bread was coarse and gritty enough that it visibly ground down teeth over a lifetime, something you can still see in surviving mummies today. Salted, dried fish was a common preserved food. Natron, the same sodium compound harvested from dry lake beds and famous for mummification, had domestic uses too. Dates and figs delivered sugar and potassium in an efficient package. Nobody was thinking about electrolytes, but a diet built on salted bread, salted fish, potassium-rich fruit, and oceans of low-alcohol beer landed almost exactly on the fluid and mineral balance a laborer in extreme heat actually needs. That's the pattern running through this entire story. Not genius. Iteration. Repeated for 3,000 years until it looked designed by someone holding a physiology textbook. Now here's the part that changes everything. We've spent this whole video treating the desert as the enemy Egyptians were quietly defending against. Flip that completely. Egyptians called the fertile black soil along the Nile Kemet, the Black Land. They called the desert flanking it Deshret, the Red Land. And that red land wasn't hostile scenery sitting outside the story. It was a wall nobody had to build, maintain, or guard. Hundreds of miles of lethal, waterless sand on both sides meant no invading army could cross with functioning supply lines. That's a major reason Egypt held a stable, recognizable identity for 3,000 years, while civilizations across Mesopotamia kept getting conquered and reconquered on what feels like a rotating schedule. And the dryness that made daily life brutal is the exact reason we know anything about ancient Egypt at all. Papyrus rots fast in humidity. Linen rots. Human tissue rots. In dry desert heat, almost none of it does. Mummification itself grew directly out of watching bodies buried in hot sand naturally preserve themselves, centuries before anyone built the first embalming table. The heat didn't just get survived, it got recruited, guarding the border and preserving the archive at the same time. So let's pull this together. First, there was never one single trick keeping Egyptians alive. It was layered engineering. Walls, wind, fabric, beer, salt, timing, each one covering exactly where the previous system ran out of road. Second, none of it required genius in the way we usually mean that word. It required attention, repeated across enough generations that trial and error eventually looked indistinguishable from design. Third, and this is the one worth keeping, the very thing that made Egypt dangerous to live in is the same thing that let it survive politically and get remembered historically. The desert wasn't a problem Egypt solved despite itself. It was the whole reason the civilization worked the way it did. So picture that mudbrick house one more time. Thick walls holding on to yesterday's cool air, a wind scoop pulling a desert breeze down through the ceiling, a sweating clay jar cooling that air on its way in, a family asleep on the roof under a completely cloudless sky, and a jar of thick beer waiting for morning. None of it needed electricity. None of it can really break in a way mud and hands can't fix. It has no off switch, because it never needed an on switch either. Meanwhile, we've spent the last century solving the same problem by hanging a machine in a window that dumps its waste heat straight back into the street, making the whole block hotter in the process, so we buy a bigger machine. Architects working in the American Southwest today are quietly going back to tomb paintings from Thebes, studying a hole in a roof angled at the wind, because it turns out that was a genuinely excellent idea the entire time. You'll get warm today too, and you'll fix it almost without thinking, reaching for a thermostat instead of a jar of water. Same species, same sweat glands, same 2% margin before your thinking starts to slip. The only real difference is architecture and, frankly, better beer on our end. So here's the question I'll leave you with. No fridge, no fan, a roof for a bedroom, and warm beer for breakfast every single day for years. Could you actually do it? Let me know in the comments. Until then, see you soon.